Now, I've got another 10 minutes at least, so I'll move on to my third topic, which is about what is happening, in my view, in terms of left and right in Europe. You know, when I was young, it's quite a long time ago, it was fairly straightforward. The left was in favour of social provision, welfare state, equality. The right was in favour of markets and freedom. Well, all this is in the hopper now. It's almost impossible to make any kind of clarity between left and right in these terms. But crucially what happened, and this is the first proposition I want to make to you, is that in 1968, a symbolic year, obviously this is the year of the great upheaval. This is the year of the 68 in French. I'm certainly old enough to remember the Paris days, watched it on television, I was living in London at that time, had a small family anyway, no way that I was going to go there. I sort of watched it with sort of horrid fascination actually. But the key point I want to make is that this post-war boom generation, bulge generation, basically was demographically so large that it created its own critical mass and was thereby capable of generating a subculture, an alternative view of the world, which is quite left-wing, inchoate, not necessarily clear definitions of left-wing. And they've been there ever since, 40 years, 45 years, depends on how you count it. I believe that what I've lived through is actually the hegemony of a left-wing epistemology, when the left-wing perceptions, the left-wing ideas were naturalized. That's the way in which normal people think. Well, in that sense, perhaps I never was a normal person, so I'll tell you this little story. The scene is London, let's say 1973 or something like that. It was a dinner party in North London with lots of fashionable left-wing persons, except me. And they went on and on and on about the class struggle, you know, how we must fight the class struggle and all that. So I listened to this. What do these people have to do with the class struggle? What do they really know about it? I, of course, knew what it actually meant in places like Hungary, and not just in Hungary. And finally I said to them, I had enough. My patience had run out. Look, I believe in the class struggle too, but from the other side. Terrible shock. Utter silence. Total dismay. How could anybody say anything as provocative as that? I got a real telling off from my wife later on. And you can't possibly say things like that. But what I'm suggesting to you is that there was this totally normalized set of assumptions about what the world was about. And that, I think, has remained not static, but pretty stable ever since. I would say these set of assumptions are seriously outdated for a whole lot of reasons, partly to do with globalization, partly to do with the coming into being of new generations. Your generation obviously being only one of them, because there are at least 2 or 3 above you who don't necessarily believe that what the 68ers say is Holy Writ. If you read the novels of Alain Houellebecq, the French writer, you will see really powerful attacks on this. I mean, he's the son of a 68, and I don't think he's ever forgiven his mother for that. The left has innovated, it seems to me, in 2 major areas. One is the acceptance of the environment as an issue. I don't, I may say, have a problem with this. I regard myself as not very light, but light green. This, of course, has pushed the left to some extent away from Enlightenment rationality and towards accepting a different basic assumption about the world, sustainability rather than production. Economic growth is no longer the be-all and the end-all, and there are interesting contrasts there between the older left and the younger left. It's the younger left which is driven by environmentalism, climate change and so on. Secondly, the invention of the Rainbow Coalition, that with the decline of the manufacturing working class, which is a widespread phenomenon throughout Europe, old and new, and in a sense, that's why it seems to me why the term old Europe is not all that meaningful, because that class structure has gone, not completely, but very largely. The left has gone about creating the Rainbow Coalition, which is basically immigrants, gender, identity, disability, possibly these different groups of this kind, which quite vary considerably from country to country. That's why I can't be very specific about it. What I think the left no longer has is a theory of the state. What is the state for? What is to be the welfare state? The welfare state model, it seems to me at this time, is distinctly shaky because the left has accepted so much of the ideology of the market. Varies in intensity and quantity. And secondly, of course, what do you do with state bureaucracy? Do you debureaucratize, but in that case you make the state less effective, and so on and so forth. Secondly, how much state should there actually be? Little, lot? To what extent should the individual be responsible for his or her own future? How much? This is Ulrich's argument. How much risk should an individual accept? Classically, the state took on a great deal of the risk that the individual simply couldn't take on. The argument is an interesting one, and I think a cogent one. How much risk in the face of the global market? Suppose that you're a small manufacturer in some area, along comes outsourcing, and you're simply wiped out. That particular good which you're making is made much more cheaply in China. The effect of the rise of China, the entry of China in the global market, has meant that something like 20% of the European unskilled working class is unemployable, because that work is done much more cheaply in China. But these are citizens, you can't throw them in the street. What's the state to do about this? It means you've got to support quite a sizable section of the population, at least to give them a dignity. It's certainly my position on this. I don't think a purely economic answer on this is acceptable, certainly not for me. Secondly, I don't think the left anymore, if it ever did have, a theory of what is the democratic right. What does it mean to be right-wing? I mean, there again, there are various answers as to what does it mean to be right-wing, which I'm not going to go into. So, at that point, in the absence of a theory, it's very easy to stereotype phenomena which you don't like, which challenge your own assumptions. And the third point is, well, what should the left's response be to the present economic crisis? I don't see one. And if you look at the election pattern throughout Europe, not very many exceptions, the right is doing well and the left is doing not very well in the biggest crisis of capitalism since the 1930s. What is happening here? All my assumptions acquired when I was young, in the rubbish bin. I mean, it's an extraordinary turnaround. The left is no longer left-wing, the right, I'm not sure whether it's left or right, but certainly what I sense in the European right is a commitment to social protectionism. The Christian democracy is strong on this. It's there in conservatism and other fields. So, in order to deal with this problem, and don't forget the left, the European democratic, social democratic left did suffer a defeat with the collapse of communism. It may not have been the way in which the democratic left wanted to organize society. I don't think there are very many people on the left, some I know, are committed to having gulag and collectivization and coercion and so on, but on the whole, they didn't like it. But on the other hand, they did on the whole accept that communism, sort of Soviet-type systems were sort of part of the family, dubious parts of the family okay, but they were still somehow there. So when communism collapses, the worldview collapses with it. And to some degree that affects the Western left as well. They don't really have an answer as to what did communism collapse. I have answers, but that's another story.